and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast, looking back at last weekend's Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined solely by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year. It is, of course, Sam, absolutely, and yes, if you watch on YouTube, he's just done the double piece. Coop. Ian Parks is sadly not with us for this episode because, and give me a second, he is currently... I'll give you an update. Flying home from Jeddah, he's 38,000 feet in the air. He's just flown over Albania and is now very nicely going along the coast of Croatia. So, Ian, hope you're having a very nice flight. But, Sam, just me and you for this episode. How are you, mate? Because this triple header has been intense. It has been enthralling. And most importantly, it is now over.
I'm okay. I'm doing all right. It has been intense. It has been, a long stretch. My wedding and honeymoon now feel like a distant memory. I feel like any kind of benefit of having some time off has now fully departed me. But yeah, no, I'm all right. I'm very much looking forward to getting into some of these topics for today, though, because whilst it wasn't the most interesting race in the world in Saudi Arabia, there were some big talking points to get into. So yeah, all good on my side. How are you doing?
I am tired because you mentioned obviously there that, you know, it's quite funny because obviously the start of the triple header was in Suzuka, which feels so long ago.
Yep.
And I was unfortunate enough to have the early shifts that weekend. I then flew to Miami, of course, for Formula E. So I was then on the other side of the world in my mind, at least. And then I had the late shifts for what race we just had, Saudi Arabia. So my brain is kind of thinking like, what time is it? But you know what? I love my job, so it's okay. But how did you feel, and I've got to mention this, having your name branded across the Jeddah Corniche circuit? I mean, do you want to explain what I mean by that? Because you must be feeling pretty lucky.
Yes, I mean, to sponsor a Grand Prix is obviously a huge privilege. But no, so the eagle-eyed viewers will have seen in many photos and in broadcast shots a sponsor called STC. I don't actually even. It's foolish of me to have not looked it up, but STC is a sponsor of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. It is also my initials. My middle name is Thomas, for those of you who really care. Please don't steal my identity. So yeah, STC. Samuel Thomas.
STC. Right, shall we get on with my voice? I'll tell you what, the one thing I've seen or discovered from this triple header is my voice is on ropes. So good luck with this episode. Brilliant. Shall we start off with our fun question, of course? And it is based around our race winner, Oscar Piastri, because he has now claimed this season 4 consecutive podiums. Of course, he's had 1 third place finish in Japan, but has also won 3 of the last 4 races. What is the record for the most consecutive podiums by a McLaren driver? Now, bonus points for naming the driver, how many podiums it was consecutively, and in particular, if you can name the races they claim those podiums between.
Goodness me, that is a difficult question.
Oscar's on 4, and of course, that's not the record, but he's on good form.
Is it by any chance Lewis Hamilton?
It is Lewis Hamilton.
Is it by any chance from the Malaysian Grand Prix in 2007 to so he won in Canada. It was about 9. I think he got 9 podiums in his first 10 because he finished 4th in his debut. Is it by any chance 9 in a row? And is it Lewis Hamilton in 2007?
You're correct.
Oh, I mean, what a run for a rookie.
Fair play. I'll give you that. I'll tell you what, you're on fire today. So as you're on fire, you can go first, Sam. What was, and good luck, your biggest takeaway from the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix?
As far as biggest takeaways go, I don't think we really need to go any further than the first corner, to be fair.
Yeah.
It was to many people, a contentious move and then subsequent decision by the stewards. McLaren don't see it that way. Many other people, probably many in the paddock, don't quite see it that way. But it is obviously a big talking point of the weekend is how Red Bull and Max Verstappen conduct themselves in those moments and how they respond to them. And actually, for me, the biggest take home was that in some ways, not giving back the place, suffering the penalty, was a genius move by Red Bull. Because as we've seen this season, being in the clean air is so key to having a strong race. And they didn't give that up by handing the position back to Oscar. So in some ways, you could interpret it as sacrificing the victory, but actually securing second place. Because had he gone behind Oscar, he would have had George on his tail. I mean, for starters, he could have lost the position at the restart to George. It just could have snowballed from there. So my biggest take home is actually, it's more of a question. Was that not somewhat of a masterstroke by Red Bull?
That's a very interesting take. My biggest takeaway, and it kind of leads on to something I discussed in last week's podcast after, what race was it? After Bahrain. And that is, I have a feeling we've been reading this season wrong in terms of people believing it was going to be between Lando and Max. I really do believe that, and we'll discuss this a little bit later on, I don't think Lando's in the title picture personally. For me, this season is Oscar versus Max, and I think we saw the first glimmer of what that battle could be like at the first corner on the opening lap, and I think that's going to be something very, very interesting to watch as this season develops and arguably as the RB21 continues to improve, because that is something we'll discuss in a little bit, because it does seem that there are certain types of circuit, particularly when there's low downforce and high speed corners, where it does seem the RB21 and Max look pretty strong. Let's get on, though, very quickly to doing our bold predictions. Well, so our predictors leaderboard from the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And, well, none of us, it was Nicola representing the fans. Nobody got points for pole position because we all predicted McLaren drivers. And, of course, Max claimed pole. None of us got points for the fastest lap, which was claimed by Lando Norris, of course. Ian got 3 points for correctly guessing Ferrari would claim the fastest pit stop. They've actually now got the three fastest pit stops of the season. They've locked out 5 of the top 7 fastest pit stops of the season. So
I don't know if you remember, during the race, I actually took to slack to be like, why?
Ferrari are exchanging 2 seconds flat. Ferrari are exchanging pace in their car for rapid pit stops, it would seem. In terms of the race, though, this is where things get interesting, because I said that Lando Norris would win. So silly me, yourself, Ian, and Nicola all said Oscar Piastri. So you all got 3 points for that. I said Oscar would finish second, so therefore I got 1 point for that, because obviously if your prediction is 1 position out, you get 1 point. And crucially, you said that Verstappen would finish in third, and of course he finished second. You got a point for that. Ian said Norris would finish third. He finished fourth, so he got a point for that. I said Leclerc would finish third, and of course he did. So I got 3 points for that. But what it all means is that Nicola, for the fans, got 3 points. Myself and you, Sam, got 4 points. But it means that Ian got a very healthy 7 points, which means in the Racing News 365.com podcast, Predictor Leaderboard Championship, or whatever you want to call it, Sam, you're still in last on 21 points. The fans are only just above you in third on 22 points. And now, with a pretty comfortable advantage, Ian is in second on 30 points, but now catching me because I'm still in the lead on 33. So exciting stuff in the world of predicted games. But it's a very interesting point looking at those predictions, in that, yes, a couple of us thought Max would get on the podium. Nobody thought, just like in Japan, nobody thought that he would claim pole position. Nobody thought he would even compete to win the race. And that's the remarkable thing, is that once again, despite all the odds, Max was right there on the pace, if not better, than the McLarens.
So this is, I think, one of the interesting kind of extensions of your biggest takeaway from the weekend, is where the RB21 seems to excel. In my read, in many ways, is that that's really where Max excels, is these high-speed circuits, and especially the ones that are driver circuits. That is where Max's ability and his skill is able to really kind of be amplified, because it is more down to the driver. And so his brilliance shines through. We saw that in Japan. We saw that in Saudi Arabia. He got that. He finally corrected the wrongs of that 2021 qualifying lap with two sublime efforts when he did the kind of the very risky back-to-back run.
Yes.
At the end of qualifying. So for me, I think it really kind of shows. But I think if you look through those predictions, a lot of us, particularly me, I'm often putting Max on a podium. I don't want to count him out in the race because he's Max. But we are missing a trick because we are counting him out in qualifying because of that one lap advantage that the McLaren has at the moment. So yeah, maybe we need to readdress that. I mean, I certainly do. I'm having an absolute shocker. So yeah, there you go.
But I think it raises the point though that, it's kind of inevitable that eventually, the RB21 in terms of the actual package will get closer to McLaren's MCL 39 at some point this season. Of course, we expect that the majority of the big upgrades will be done around Imola time, maybe just after in Barcelona. But this is the point, is that if Max is able, not necessarily every circuit, if Max can compete and at times beat either one or both of the McLarens at a few races when, as we've seen already this season, the McLarens are tripping themselves up, in particular Lando, and something we will discuss later on, Max is going to be there or thereabouts coming into the season when it comes to hopefully him winning a record equaling 5th consecutive F1 driver's title. It almost feels inevitable that despite the fact McLaren do have, regardless whether it's a big margin, a small margin, overall the best package on the grid. But it feels inevitable that Max is going to be there coming into the season because firstly, he's Max and we know what he can do in a bad car, let alone in a car as incredible as what we saw a couple of years ago in the RB19. I think Yuki Tsunoda, by the way, is going to love driving that car for Miami, just putting out there. That's going to be some pretty cool experience for him. But Max is going to be there, isn't he, coming in the season? Because it does feel like, and it was really interesting listening to Zach Brown discussing Oscar and Lando in that he knows it's a matter of when, not if, Lando and Oscar do eventually have a collision, whether they crash into each other or whatnot. It's going to happen. Max is going to be there to pick up the pieces because in Saudi Arabia, as we saw with Lando crashing, McLaren opened the door to Max. He did not need a second invitation.
This is also where you could apply the logic where you say that we've been reading the season wrong. I think you can also apply that kind of theory to this because I think so much of what our predictions of how the year will shake out have been based on last year, how really Max only he was able to maintain that advantage because of how strong his start was to the year. And there was this general consensus that without that, he wouldn't have won the title. And so therefore, the start of this year, McLaren being very strong, it's kind of like, well, there's no way Max can hang with them for 24 rounds. Andrea Stella himself has said that. It'll be very, very difficult for him to do so without the quickest car. And he doesn't have the quickest car at the moment, or at least that's what we kind of felt. Whether or not that remains, true. Lando is saying that he was quickest in race trim, and looking at the data, he was pretty quick in race trim, more so than we'd expect from the Red Bull 21, the RB21. But I think, so we've been reading it wrong, I think, in many ways, because Max is proving that he will just be that kind of persistent threat, almost a pest to the McLarens, and he will pick up those pieces as and when those guys kind of drop points, which they will do. I think it's very easy to forget how the points are divided across any given weekend, that you can stay in there for longer than you maybe would expect to or ought to. Going into Saudi Arabia, George Russell was only 14 points off the lead of the championship. It has grown now. I think it's 26 to Oscar. Obviously, George finished 5th, Oscar won. But, 14 points after 4 rounds, you go, that's pretty decent for a guy who hasn't really come close to taking a race victory. But it just underlines the point that Max will be able to stay with them if he can maintain this pace. And yeah, a lot depends on how the points shake out for the McLarens. And yes, they will have those moments at some point. Zach Brown is absolutely right on that. What will be really fascinating to see from that is how McLaren manage that, because they're so proud of their whole 2 number 1 driver stance.
And what's interesting as well is that when you look at the race data from Saudi Arabia last weekend, actually, if it wasn't for the 5-second time penalty, which we are going to discuss next, Max would have won that race. But of course, there's so many things to then go into in that regard to, okay, if Max hadn't been penalised, would Oscar have pushed more? Did Oscar actually have more pace in the bag? He was just managing his race, preserving his tyres. But ultimately, the data shows that based on the pace they were running at in the race, regardless of what was with everything that went on around them, Max had the pace to win, which I think is very, very interesting. But anyways, let's discuss, of course, lap 1, turns, 1 and 2. And of course, Max Verstappen started on pole, Oscar Piastri alongside him. Oscar made the better start, had the inside go into the first corner. Max took to the inside of the chicane, rejoined the circuit ahead of Oscar, maintained the lead. And of course, as he didn't give back the position, obviously continued to build an advantage, received a 5-second time penalty from the stewards. He served it during his pit stop, which ultimately allowed Oscar to take the lead of the race and eventually the race win. Now, of course, what was really interesting, Ian and I discussed in Sunday's post-race F1 update, we obviously read through the official verdicts from the stewards. And obviously, I'll just quickly point out, I'm not going to read through the whole thing again because it was a long one. But just to pick out a couple of really interesting points. Obviously, it was a 5-second time penalty. The stewards actually noted that under normal circumstances, for this crime, this offence, it would actually be a 10-second time penalty. Well, it would be a 10-second time penalty, but obviously, as it was lap 1, first corner, they deemed that was a mitigating circumstance and, of course, reduced the penalty to 5 seconds. What's also interesting is, obviously, they judged based on all the telemetry, all the video footage, everything they have access to, which we as media and obviously the fans don't have access to. We can take as many screenshots as we want. Obviously, Christian Horner did take some interesting photographic evidence to his media scrum, not for the first time in his career, but the FIA could see that based on the exact points of the apex to it, the entry of the corner, the entry of turn 1, Oscar was alongside on the inside of Max, and therefore, based on the driver's standard guidelines, Oscar shredding, that's a new word. Oscar is then entitled. It's been a long few days, mate. Oscar is then. I had actually mini Weetabix, but anyway, Oscar. I'm still a kid at heart. I might be 25. I'm still a kid at heart, but anyway, Oscar was allowed and entitled to be given room by Max. In the end, of course, we saw what happened. Now, I've been reading, of course, a lot of comments following Sunday's F1 update, as I always do. We also ran a poll at Racing News 365 in regard to, was Verstappen's incident with Oscar deserving of a penalty? 50%, and we've had thousands of votes, by the way. So I've been with Racing News now for just over a year, and this is, I think, the most votes I've seen, most votes a poll gets. Just over 50% believe, yes, the penalty was deserving. 44% believe it should have been no penalty. 6% are on the fence and not sure. But for me, regardless of this, a lot of people were calling that the FIA should have told Red Bull to make Max give back the position to Oscar and then let them race. And of course, yes, they could have done that. And this is something I'm intrigued to do. But is it their responsibility to do that? Because obviously Max must have had maybe a little bit of a feeling. He obviously felt he was given no room and that he was pushed off by Oscar. Should it have been Red Bull to tell Max to give back the position? Because as we saw in Bahrain, of course, Lando Norris exceeded track limits to overtake Lewis Hamilton, of course, but all four wheels beyond the white line. McLaren saw that Lando would likely get a penalty, told him to give the position back, which he did. And of course, then the investigation was dropped. Do you think Max can feel aggrieved by his own team a little bit in not telling him to give back the position? Because at the same time, it doesn't feel like it's actually the FIA's responsibility to be asking a driver or a team to give back a position, or actually, is this something to learn for the future and maybe needs implementing?
So there's a lot to unpack there.
A lot.
But for starters, it's not the FIA's responsibility. In fact, they confirmed in almost pretty much the aftermath of the moment that we don't instruct drivers or teams to do that. It's their discretion. And actually, had Red Bull made the call to switch places, which I've already kind of highlighted earlier in my takeaway, that could have actually been the worst of two evils for Red Bull. But had they done that, the investigation likely would have been dropped. So that is from the FIA. So it very much does sit with Red Bull. Interestingly, Jonathan Wheatley, who was the former sporting director at Red Bull, now team principal at stake, after the race was obviously, naturally asked about this incident, didn't explicitly say that he would have told Max to give back the position or sent those orders down to GP Lambiase, but he did say that he would have done something differently and that he had conversations about this during that moment. So that's quite interesting, actually, to see some of the knock-on effects there that Red Bull maybe have kind of are suffering by losing some of these key players like Jonathan Wheatley. Because ultimately, I don't think Max can feel aggrieved that Red Bull didn't tell him to give back the place, because Max himself didn't think he had to. Max would have been annoyed had he been told to give back the place because, and I quote, Max said, "He forced me off. There was no intention of him to make the corner." So we'll unpack that a little bit in a moment. But I think the situation with Red Bull not telling Max to give back the place is a product of how they manage Max. And this has been called out by McLaren in the past. McLaren feel that Red Bull are kind of too yes men like with Max and are too soft and don't, kind of almost pander to it. And that creates situations where Max is, kind of reinforced in his views that he's correct because no one's saying, well, actually, you got that one wrong there, mate. Sorry. And that almost does him a disservice. So I think this is an extension of that to a certain degree of the environment of Red Bull where they don't challenge Max in the ways that McLaren and other opposition and maybe the media and maybe some fans would kind of like to see or would expect to see perhaps. So you've got that as well. But then actually addressing the incident, I think 5 seconds was actually a little bit too lenient. And Nick, I know we maybe slightly have differing opinions on this.
Yeah.
But for me, that whole kind of, so the mitigating circumstances given by the FIA, they said that usually this would be a 10-second penalty, as you said, but we're giving 5 because it was the first lap. For me, that's the kind of thing that's reserved for a racing incident or for these kind of real, like, oh, this was a marginal thing. No one was to blame. There was no kind of active decision. There was no deliberateness to those actions. So therefore mitigating circumstances. For me, what Max did was very deliberate. And for starters, there was no case of, whether or not Oscar deserved space. It was Oscar's corner. He was, the axles were wrong side. Oscar was on the inside. Therefore, it is his corner and it is his right, as per the racing guidelines and the ones that Max has championed in the past and utilized to his advantage that permit Oscar to not leave him any space. And actually, so where Max kind of says there was no intention of him to make the corner, Max is wrong because Oscar did make the corner. And that is the critical thing. The changes to the racing guidelines over the winter wouldn't have any impact on this at all. This would be the same situation as last time. But what's really key is Max was only alongside because he feathered out the throttle, or the brake, sorry. He kind of lessened on the brake to carry the momentum in to stay alongside Oscar. Otherwise, he would have had to concede the position. So Max was only in that position because he was never going to make the corner anyway. So that's the big thing for the FIA and why they kind of went the way they did. And I think that nullifies Max's right to complain. He is basically seeing what it's like to be on the receiving end of his own treatment that he's kind of passed out to other drivers in the past. And you've got to say for Oscar, this is the first time in that environment, the first time he was up against Max in such a kind of a tense moment, and he passed with flying colours. He showed that he had that dog in him, to use colloquialisms. So yeah, I think there's so much to unpack. I'll pass back over to you to let you kind of say your thoughts on what I've just said, because I appreciate we could just talk about this for hours probably.
Well, it is very much a Red Bull, McLaren, a little bit of a Ferrari podcast episode. Ian Park's update. He is still at 38,000 feet, going 557 miles per hour, and about to enter Italian airspace. There's the latest on Ian Park's, everybody. So it's quite funny. I wish one day, a complete side topic, I would love us to do like a podcast whilst we're traveling or something, because Sky Sports F1, of course, did their post-Japan podcast on the bullet train, which I just thought was awesome. But that's me getting very distracted and thinking of big ideas, because I love this podcast and I think I've got so many ideas for the future. But anyways, for me, I believe the 5 seconds was fair, because in my eyes, and actually it's an interesting point you raised, because actually in regard to 10 seconds, Liam Lawson received a 10-second time penalty later in the race for an incident with Jack Doohan where he exceeded the track limits. He went off the circuit, gained an advantage at the same corner, and literally went off by the finest of margins. But ultimately, by the letter of the law, still received a 10-second time penalty because he kept the position and obviously continued to gain an advantage. What's interesting with this, and you know, they get a lot of criticism. I think the stewards and the FIA were bang on this one. If it was, in my eyes, a 5-second time penalty has sufficed because it's the first corner of the race. Both drivers ultimately know the importance of it. If you give a 10-second time penalty there, it wasn't a great race afterwards, I know, but it ruins then the rest of the race. Like Max then knows he has no chance of winning. At least with the 5 seconds, there was always the potential that something could happen. McLaren could have a really slow pit stop. There could be another safety car. Then at least Max would then be back in it. For me, I think the bigger picture here, and you touched on it, is the fact that Oscar did to Max what Max has infamously and rightly done by the letter of the law as well. He's been absolutely in his right to do what Oscar did actually on him to drivers over the last few years. In particular, of course, the main one in recent memory being Lando. Of course, he's done it with Lewis before as well. But for me, it's the first time, I think, because yes, Lando kind of took it to Max a little bit in the latter stages of last year, but always seemed to be either too tentative or actually too over the top, as we saw, of course, in Texas last year. And of course, Lando then got a penalty. For me, the thing here is in their first, let's say, battle for a race win, because let's be honest, whoever was going to come out that first 2 corners in the lead was very much likely to go and win the race because of how difficult overtaking is at the Jeddah Corniche circuit, particularly when it's such a fast-paced race as the one in Saudi Arabia is. In their first duel, let's say, for a race win between Oscar and Max, it's Oscar who has come out on top. He's kept to the rules. He's played Max at his own game. And what I loved actually from Max in particular was, whilst he was pretty short of words after the race, didn't really want to discuss the incident, fair play to him, but he actually really praised Oscar for the progress Oscar has made in what is only just his 3rd season in F1. Max really likes the way Oscar approaches racing, the way he approaches each session. And it's Max pointed out that Oscar is just so calm. He has this really calm and collected attitude and demeanor to him, which is the complete opposite to Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton to a certain extent as well, which is very fascinating when you look at those drivers who, you know, have either won championships in the past or have been tipped to win championships. In Lando's case, Oscar, for me, now has so much confidence coming out of this that he knows he can race Max. And I think Max will actually, I'd love to know what he was feeling under that helmet, because would there be a side of him that's thinking, fair play, mate, fair play, Oscar? Because Max will know, I'm pretty sure, you know, that what Oscar did deep down was okay. Of course, you're going to complain because obviously you want to get the race when you want the things to go on your side. But Max must, I think, watch that back and be like, okay, all right, this kid can give me a good run for my money. But I love that because we want to see drivers taking the fight to Max, because Max has been so many levels above everybody else now for a few seasons. He's been untouchable. It's nice to see, as was the case in 2021 with Lewis having dominated for so many years and Max really took the fight to him. It was so refreshing to see, regardless of obviously the way it ended and whatnot, and obviously what Michael Massey did, but to see a driver, in this case Oscar, taking the fight to Max, playing Max at his own game. I'm so excited now for the rest of the season, which is why I mentioned my biggest takeaway. I'm kind of already ruling Lando out of the title picture because I just don't think he's got the mental strength to do it. Oscar, I think, quite clearly has. He has a brilliant manager in Mark Webber, something else that Max also pointed out. Max actually compared the fact that Oscar has Mark Webber in his corner to kind of be guided by, to take, you know, inspiration from, based on Mark's experience, obviously racing for Red Bull, fighting Seb Vettel for championships. But also Max compared that to the way he's been brought up, of course, with his dad, Jos Verstappen, who's obviously trained Max and brought him up to be the best, to, you know, go to the limit and beyond it, you know, for the ultimate glory, for wins, for championships and whatnot. And it has worked. An absolute treat for me. And again, this is something I mentioned in last week's podcast, where I'm kind of getting a bit sick and tired of this. So many F2 and F3 drivers being given this, oh, they're a future world champion, this and that. Oscar is one of the drivers who was given that. And for me, he is the only one in the last few years that's been given that title. And I just do not see how he is not going to become a world champion, whether it's this year, whether it's in the future, but more likely a multi-world champion. I just think I think Oscar is brilliant. And I think there's a driver there who, depending on what Max does, where he goes, how Red Bull are next season, and obviously how McLaren are, Oscar has, I think, that ability where he could actually dominate in the future. I really, really do. And that's the point that I wanted to make to you, Sam, is Oscar now, based on what we've seen, obviously we're still not too sure how much Red Bull will improve. We expect they will, but of course McLaren also will have upgrades in the pipeline and will come better themselves. Oscar has now taken the championship lead by 10 points. We've seen the issues that Lando's been having this season. Is Oscar now, at this moment in time, the title favourite?
Yes, he is. And in fact, by bookmakers' odds, he was after Bahrain as well.
Yeah.
So the odds will be even shorter than they were a week ago. I think it's too early to rule out Lando, personally. And I think there's a few things for that. A, it's so early in the year. B, it's only 10 points in it. Reliability could come into it, all kinds of stuff. But with Lando, the race pace has remained strong. He's worked his way back through in the last couple of weekends. And after the race in Saudi Arabia, he was kind of saying, I'm actually pretty happy with how the race went. I can't really complain. I'm making it more tough for myself than I need to in qualifying. And he absolutely is. But this is the thing, and this is where I think it could turn, is that whilst Oscar has turned what was a weakness in his qualifying into a strength this year, he's definitely closed the gap to Lando. Lando had 8 pole positions last year. He proved himself to be very, very good over one lap. I don't think that just vanishes as quickly as it kind of at first maybe appears to the last couple of races. I think he's just had a difficult stretch. I think he will be able to pull himself back into it. But to address the kind of, the overarching kind of point that you were making about how kind of Max is almost showing I don't think respect is the right word, but a level of consideration to Oscar that you kind of never quite got the feeling he was giving to Lewis or Lando, I think is really interesting. There is almost this level of admiration there. And yeah, I think, yes, he obviously said the things in the heat of the moment that I called out previously about Oscar, kind of deliberately kind of running him off the track and not making the corner. And I think he would have, once he cooled down or once he saw it again, he probably would have gone, yeah, actually, fair enough. He did make the corner. I can't really argue with that one.
Well, we saw them laughing in the cool-down room after the race.
Exactly. And so I think, but there is a very different dynamic, I feel, between Oscar and Max. And how that then plays out will be really fascinating because Max has had a very similar approach, as I said, with Lando and Lewis, and it served him well. Let's face it. So will he be able to maintain that kind of that on track and also that psychological advantage that he has enjoyed at points? It'll be really difficult to see. And again, you mentioned Mark Webber. I think it's really fascinating now that, and it's been kind of pointed out, I think, by Jake in our team, and also I've seen a couple of people mention it online, how Oscar versus Lando has become somewhat of a proxy war for Mark Webber versus Sebastian Vettel. However, it's really interesting to see how they're now backing almost the different horses.
Yeah.
Whereas you would probably say that Seb, although a more fierce and punchy character than Oscar, he was that kind of, really assured, like, I'm going to take this and I'm going to be uncompromising with it kind of approach. And Mark was the one who kind of was then left to kind of struggle with the kind of number 2 driver status. And obviously McLaren's set up very differently, but it's interesting. It almost feels like they're playing slightly different roles, but it's really key, I think, for Oscar, what Mark learned during his career is that, kind of, we say that, some people are great, or some presidents are great presidents and some presidents are great ex-presidents or former presidents. It's almost that kind of thing. Some F1 drivers are great whilst they're driving and some are great in what they do next. And I think Mark has been a hugely, hugely important. And we've seen that a hugely important kind of role model for and influence in Oscar's life. And we saw that by the decision to leave Alpine, and then it snowballed from there. So yeah, it's going to be a really interesting dynamic. I think it is too early to call Lando out of the race, and I think I completely take your opinion, and I think you probably feel it's acceptable to have a different opinion on it. It's one of those things where it's marginal, right?
But the thing is, though, it appears that our audience at Racing News 365 do agree with me, because obviously we also ran a poll post qualifying in regard to, after obviously Lando crashing in Q3, will Lando Norris's mistakes cost him the F1 driver's title this year? And 65% expect that, yes, Lando's mistakes will cost him the title. It's a massive margin. 27% believe he'll still win it. 8% are on the fence and not sure. And that's my thing, because I think it's almost being overlooked that from these first 5 races, which I know you mentioned, obviously there's still a lot of racing to go. These first 5 races have flown by. We have 19. I do my maths quickly. 19 to go. I think my maths is correct.
Yeah.
24 minus 5. Quick maths, Nick. 19 to go. Maths is. I love maths, but it's not my forte on this podcast. 19 races is going to absolutely fly by, especially now as we're entering after Miami, of course, and obviously with the exception of Canada, the European part of the season where the rounds do tick away so quickly. Especially now that really in a few races' time, there'll be no more upgrades, which is a remarkable thing to be saying as well. I just look at Lando and I think you've won 1 race from the first 5. Your teammate has won 3. Your teammate in Oscar has made, in my eyes, 1 mistake in the first 5 races. And that was, of course, in Melbourne, where, of course, he went off into the grass and lost what would have been, at worst, you imagine, second place, because they look like a pretty comfortable McLaren 1-2. The fact that that could have had such a huge swing on the championship as well in terms of the advantage Oscar has. That's 1 mistake for Oscar in 5 races. He has been so consistent, even on the times when he's been slower than Lando or slower than Max as he was in Japan. He's still been there to pick up the points, to get a podium, to move on to the next race. Lando has made, and don't get me wrong, I think Lando is a massive talent. He is such a quick driver. I just look at him and I wonder, do you have the fact that he addresses himself, how he's still not comfortable with the car, the pressure and everything. I just don't know if Lando has what it takes ultimately. And I'd happily be proven wrong. Does he have what it takes to win an F1 driver's title? I feel he's better suited to the hunter role in chasing the leader rather than being the hunted, in regard to him being at the top of the standings and waiting for the people to catch him up, because now he's fallen, of course, to second. It'll be very interesting how he bounces back to, ultimately regain the lead of the standings against Oscar, because quite clearly he's going to have to take the fight to his teammate, because Oscar is looking pretty faultless, whereas Lando, in the majority of qualifying sessions this season, has made at least 1 mistake in quite a few races as well. He's made errors, but enough of McLaren and Red Bull, because I've seen the time. We've still got Ferrari to discuss. So very, very quickly, Ferrari, I think for me, the biggest confusion of 2025 so far, seemingly electric in their pit stops. As I mentioned, they've had the 3 fastest pit stops this season. They've actually had 5 of the 7 fastest pit stops this year as well. They've had pretty woeful qualifying pace. If you forget about, obviously, Lewis claiming pole for the sprint race in China, of course, then winning the sprint race there as well. Ferrari's pace in qualifying has been absolutely nowhere. Charles Leclerc, to give him credit, has been delivering a masterclass in that SF25 to even be getting into the top 5, into the top 4. Of course, then had really, really good pace in the race to finish 3rd, and actually pointed out, it was Fred Vasseur that pointed out, had Ferrari been in clean air, actually, they could have won the race. Charles Leclerc had, for the last 40 laps of that race, the same pace as Max and Oscar, which is part of the reason why Lando ultimately failed to get past Leclerc, because Leclerc genuinely was actually pretty quick. That's an interesting thing, Sam, because quite clearly there is some potential. There is pace somewhere in that SF25. But it does feel that, at least in qualifying, Ferrari just don't know how to unlock it.
The biggest issue for Ferrari at the moment is that the issues and the problems they're coming up against seem to change.
Yeah.
And Leclerc said this in his post-race comments in the press conference, is that, kind of the difficulties we had in qualifying weren't the difficulties we then had in the race, and they were different from the difficulties we had in Bahrain and before. And so trying to actually then pinpoint and identify what the underlying cause of all of that is incredibly difficult. And he did say, look, it's going to be in the data. It's just a case of finding it. And then once we found it, it's a case of correcting it. And there is definitely pace there. We saw it last year, and we saw last year how you can really make steps when you do find that correct balance and that, whatever that, quantity you've been missing. And I think Fred Vasseur is also right that this is a qualifying championship. This is a clean air championship. And had Ferrari been afforded that luxury, they may well have had the pace to win this Grand Prix, which is why qualifying, as you mentioned, is then so key. And they've just looked at, and it's not drastically off. Like, well, I guess it's a few tenths, isn't it?
Especially in Lewis's case, he's been well off.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Lewis and Charles are very different. I think you've got to view them, or at the moment, and this is maybe an extreme example, saying, comparing the Red Bull drivers, but maybe comparing the Mercedes drivers at the moment. Kimi Antonelli is consistently 3 or 4 tenths off George Russell. And that is no slight on Kimi Antonelli. He's 5 races into his F1 career. That was to be expected. George Russell has been superb this season. So, but I think there's a similar comparison to make there, where they're just in slightly different leagues at the moment in terms of what they're able to produce. We've covered Lewis extensively, both on this podcast and, on the website, and the difficulties he's coming up against. And there's an element if he just needs time. But with Charles, he needs the car to click. He needs the team to find those things, because Charles is on the limit already. He's found what he can find within himself to maximize and get the most out of the car. It's now over to the team to get him into a championship position. And it's interesting. He was saying after the race, the gap's about 50 points now. I don't want it to get any larger than that. Like, we're not thinking about a huge amount, but that is a concern. And over the next few races, we kind of need to maintain that deficit. I think it's so fascinating that he's even thinking about the championship or even mentioning it, because I think we're so quick to write drivers off, and we're proven so badly wrong for doing that, at least with the Constructors' Championship last season, how that developed over the course of the year. So going back to the original question, the biggest concern for Ferrari is they don't know what they don't know, it feels like. And so this could be a season-long struggle to identify these problems. And that's what Lewis has indicated. He said it's going to be painful. Ferrari are quite defensive at the moment over kind of those kind of suggestions as kind of, well, how has it gone so badly wrong given how you finished last season? So it's a really perplexing and kind of puzzling situation there at the moment, and one that honestly is very, very difficult to read. And I think we need a little bit more time to be able to say, well, that is specifically their issue, because they have the race pace, they just don't have it over one lap.
I completely agree. And just finally, Ian is about to fly over Trento in Italy and enter the Stelvio National Park. Well, not enter, fly over. If it was entering, I'd be a bit concerned. Sab, just to finish things off, given we now have obviously no race this weekend, we've got a week off. Looking ahead to Miami, coming out these first 5 races, what is your biggest question going into Miami now? I'll give you a second. Okay, I'll go for mine. Mine is going to be, I think it's difficult to look past how is Lando going to react. Lando came out of Bahrain saying that he needed a reset. He could have done with a few more days off before Saudi Arabia. He's now going to have that time to have some time off. He's going to have a chance to go back to Woking, look at the data, see what's been happening with the car, to try and get comfortable. Obviously, he has very, very good memories of Miami, having claimed his first F1 win there last season. But he's got to turn it on now, because if he doesn't, Oscar and Max are going to start building, I think, a little bit of a points cushion. And once that happens, Lando's going to start chasing the championship, which is not what I think. It'll be maybe a repeat of last season, but my biggest question is going to be, how is Lando going to respond to now having had time off into Miami, will he be able to react? Will he be able to respond? Will he be able to finally put an end to these unnecessary mistakes, ultimately, which he's been making, in particular in qualifying, which have been hurting him and costing him big points come the race? Is he finally going to be able to become more consistent, effectively, and put his pace to the best of its use?
To be honest, that was the direction I was going with my thinking. I think just to kind of extend that and maybe give it a slightly different angle as well is how do McLaren then deal with this?
Yeah,
and if it gets closer, I mean, it feels in some ways they're kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't with how they manage the situation. Because if Oscar does build that cushion to, we can take Max out of the equation momentarily. If Oscar does build that cushion to Lando, how quickly do they then go, okay, Oscar's our guy this year? And that's a brutal thing to do for Lando, because he was the guy last year, let's face it. But also, by Oscar winning the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, I'm pretty sure that they're now tied on 5 race wins.
They've got 5 race wins each, but also Oscar has won 10% of the F1 races he has entered, whereas Lando has won 3.75%. Of course, McLaren went through very difficult times. Yeah. But that's, same race wins, and Oscar's won 10%. That's up there with some of the best.
And so how do they respond to that situation? And how soon do they start to kind of put more and more eggs, egg by egg, into the Oscar basket, leaving Lando a little bit short of eggs? I'm going to see how many times I can get eggs into this podcast. It is a post. It is. We are recording on Easter.
It is
on
Easter Monday. It is Easter Monday. So happy Easter Monday to those who celebrate it. Just put it out there as well. Happy Easter.
Yes, happy holidays, everyone. And also, conversely, so I really threw myself off the eggs thing there. Conversely, though, is if Lando can then start to close that gap, and it does become a bit of a fight between the two of them, that's where you bring Max Verstappen back into the equation. You go, well, you're kind of opening the door for him. So this is what I mean when they're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah.
By maintaining this 2 number 1 drivers thing, and by keeping 2 drivers who are so competitive, which is a very deliberate choice by the team. They could have gone for a second driver who is less competitive and had Oscar or Lando as their quote unquote guy. And so how do they then deal with it if Max doesn't go away? If he stays and he kind of persists and he is always a threat looming over the team, are they not just going to end up sacrificing the Drivers' Championship again? They might win they probably will win the Constructors' Championship, let's face it. But they're a second year without a driver's title whilst winning the Constructors' Championship. It's not a great look. And you'd argue it doesn't necessarily scream, oh, come to McLaren, or this is an environment which you can really thrive. But then you also conversely have to respect the kind of very team first dynamic. So that will be a really fascinating thing to see how that all unfolds from the various different kind of angles that you can look at it and the variables that might dictate how that then goes.
And on that note, that brings a brilliant end to this week's episode of the Racing News 365 podcast. For those watching this podcast on YouTube, please do let us know your thoughts below on the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Any of our talking points, please do keep it friendly. Let's be very interested. That made no sense. It'd be very interesting to get your opinions, of course, on the Max and Oscar Turn 1 and your thoughts on the championship now going forward. So please do let us know. If you are watching on YouTube, please do. My English has gone. I'm very, very sorry. Please do smash the like button, subscribe to the channel. And of course, if you're listening to this on any podcast audio outlet, whatever, Spotify, YouTube, that's where you're watching it. I'm going to be quiet now because my mind has completely gone. From Ian at 38,000 feet, from myself and Sam, we will see you next Monday for the next episode of the Racing News 365 podcast. See you later.
Thanks for joining us, folks. Stay safe.